Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Diagnostics by Rick. My first series is on automotive oscilloscope use. However, before we get started on how to set up and use a scope, I thought it was a good idea to do a buyer's guide for those that may be interested in getting a scope now to follow along with videos. This will not be a super detailed video covering every scope specification in detail. I may do something like that in a future episode, but right now, I just want to make sure that you don't waste your money and you get something that will actually serve you well. I'll be brushing over some oscilloscope specification terms and what things like sample rate and bandwidth mean. I could probably make an hour-long video on each and every scope specification, but that's overkill for what I'm trying to accomplish. So forgive me if some of these explanations are oversimplified, but I think they will suffice to get my point across without going into great detail. So let's start with a spec that most people know about, and that is sample rate. For years, sample rate was all the rage when looking to buy a new scope. But to talk about sample rate, we need to talk about bandwidth at the same time. Sample rate and bandwidth are not the same thing, but they are at the top of the list along with vertical resolution when it comes to what specs are important when buying a scope. Bandwidth is how fast of a frequency a scope's sampling is. The bandwidth of the scope needs to be at least 5 times the frequency of the signal you are testing to get a good image. If your square wave has a frequency of 200 kilohertz, then your scope must have a bandwidth of at least 1 megahertz. If not, then you will not pick up all the rises and falls, especially around the corners of the square correctly, and you'll get a waveform that does not represent what is actually happening. Most people misunderstand how voltmeters and oscilloscopes measure the voltage. We think of it like we would use our eyes to look at a graduated cylinder measuring a level of liquid. And at any given point, we take a snapshot with our eyes, and that is the sample point. But if you actually think about it for a moment, our eyes work on light, and light is measured in a wavelength. If the light gets out of the wavelength that our eyes can measure, then we cannot see it, like ultraviolet or infrared light. A meter or a scope works similarly in that it uses analog waves to measure with. While our eyes cannot see a wavelength that's either too fast, like ultraviolet, or too slow, like infrared, the meter only has issues with waves that are too fast or too high of a frequency for it. Slow frequencies are never an issue. Similar to our eyes, the measurement itself is done with a wave. Look at these two images. They're the same, except for the bottom one is just zoomed in a little more. The green trace here represents the bandwidth of the sampling device in the oscilloscope. This is not actually meant to be part of a wave, but actually how the oscilloscope samples, just a representation of that. The blue pattern is what we're actually trying to measure. If you look, you can see that the frequency of our signal is significantly higher than the bandwidth of the scope. If we were trying to measure this signal with this scope, then it wouldn't see the signal properly, if at all. In the top image here, the scope bandwidth is higher than the signal frequency, but not by much. While we would definitely get a signal, it would likely chop off corners and miss out on some of the square waves completely. The bottom image shows a much better situation where the scope gets several passes over a single square in order to make sure we get a good picture of the square wave and an accurate representation of actually where it begins to rise and fall. I'm going to illustrate what it might look like if you use a scope with a bandwidth that is too low. CAN communication is the fastest signal on a vehicle, and it can be up to 1 megahertz in frequency. To properly measure it, you would need at least 5 megahertz better bandwidth on a scope. More is even better. Here I have several captures using different sample rates. I know I was just talking about bandwidth and not sample rate, but I don't have a way to change the bandwidth of the scope, so I'm going to change sample rate instead. The effects are actually similar. They may not be exactly the same, but they're close enough for you to get an idea of what I mean. In this first waveform here, I have CAN communication from a 2017 Mercedes. If we can see all the packets here, if I zoom in, you start to get a little better picture of the packets. If I zoom in even more, you can start to see defined square waves. Zoom in even more. And there you can see the square wave pattern, but if you'll notice, some of them are more like a triangle. I'll point. Here you can see the individual sample points here, 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 here. So this is actually showing why sample rate is important. This is definitely too low a sample rate. But if the bandwidth were too low, we would get something very similar. Actually, I'm going to skip down to this trace, which is only done at 100,000 samples per second. Now, if we look at the packets, they look much different. And this is because, in this case, it actually is sample rate, but this is what would happen with bandwidth. We wouldn't be able to pick up the square waves because the frequency of the square wave is too high. It's actually higher than the oscilloscope at this point. And so we miss a whole lot of squares, and this is what you get. So this is not an accurate representation of what's going on. If we speed this up to, say, 500,000, it starts to look a lot better. You can still get some, like right here. Now we get some square waves. We get some that are missing. We already saw 1 megasample, but what about 2 megasamples? 2 million samples per second. Now it's starting to look a little more regular. This is actually what it's supposed to look like, or at least close. We're still not quite right, but this is a lot better. If you notice, the triangles are pretty much all gone now, and we mostly have just square waves. So let's keep increasing it. Let's go to 5 megasamples per second, or 5 megasamples on the screen. Now, I would say 5 is definitely a good number to look at CAN communication. Remember I said it can be up to 1 million. 1 megahertz can be the frequency of a CAN communication line. Now we're at 5 million samples per second. That's the 5 times rule. So go to 10 million. Now things look really good. 5 was the minimum, 10 looks better. And lastly, I went ahead and maxed the scope out at 80 million. You can see a little difference. You can see some little kicks here. I captured some CAN communication messages on the same vehicle using my Vantage Pro as well. With 100 milliseconds of time on the screen, the capture looks similar to our zoomed out pico capture. If I cut that to 5 milliseconds, we can start to see the little information packets. If we go into 200 microseconds, we can finally see the actual pattern. While it's not done quite as good a job as pico, you can see that it actually does a pretty good job. This is where powerful digital signal processing comes into play on the part of Snap-on. Snap-on's actually able to do more with less because of good programming and strong processors. More on DSP in a few minutes. On max zoom, this tool is at 50 microseconds, and still the pattern looks pretty good. Certainly no cutoff corners or missing squares. And keep in mind that CAN communication is by far the fastest thing on a vehicle. 99% of what you'll be testing is much slower than this. So even if the Snap-on didn't do this well, it still wouldn't be a deal breaker because you don't really need it this kind of speed very often, but maybe occasionally you do. The bottom line here is if you don't have enough bandwidth for what you're testing, you won't see the picture correctly. Sample rate, on the other hand, is simply how many times the scope takes a picture of what it is measuring. This one's much easier to understand. What you need to know is that sample rate and bandwidth go together. If one is good but the other is bad, you still get a bad pattern. An oscilloscope for automotive application should be 5 megahertz or more in bandwidth. Sample rate should also be at least 5 megasamples, but more is better. You won't always need to be at this high setting, but it's good to have it. Plus, as vehicles are getting more and more advanced, we may need more power in the future. I often use my pico with it set to only 1 megasample per second. I do this because it's often all I need, but sometimes I do need more power and I have to turn up the sampling. The Snap-on scopes have a bandwidth of 3 megahertz. I'm not sure if they all do, but I think at least most do. A sample rate of 6 to 8 million per second, but they can get away with this because they cheat a little bit by having some of the best digital signal processing in the market. More on that in a few minutes. Pico automotive scopes have a bandwidth of 20 megahertz and sample rate at up to 80 million samples per second. The E-scope maxes out at 1 millisecond, and I could not find any bandwidth specs listed. The Handtech claims to have a sample rate of 1 gigasample per second and a bandwidth of 250 megahertz, but like most Chinese knockoffs, it's likely far less than that. If you've ever tested Chinese electronic equipment, they're known for greatly exaggerating their specifications, like the 18650 batteries you can get from China. They're supposed to have like 4,000 milliamp hour capacity, but when you test them, they're closer to 400 milliamp hours, not even close. So take those specs with a grain of salt. Vertical resolution is another important specification in oscilloscopes. My good friend Matt Fanslow wrote an article explaining what it is, and I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check it out for yourself. An oversimplified description of vertical resolution is how accurate the scope can be when displaying a vertical trace. An 8-bit scope can have 256 steps from top to bottom. A 12-bit scope can have 4,096. That's 2 to the 8th power versus 2 to the 12th. This is one of the main reasons that most of your cheap scopes are so bad. They are mostly 8-bit scopes, including the Handtech. This makes for very inaccurate waveforms. While 16-bit scopes do exist, like the E-scope, whose 16 bits slightly make up for the low sample rate, but only a little. It's like having a Lambo with a smart car engine. What'd you call that, a Lamborghini? 12 bits is plenty for an automotive application. I'm going to do some math here. For those of you that don't like math, it's time to go get yourself a drink. This will only take a moment, though. Consider that we typically test things between 0 and 15 volts. That would give us a division accuracy of 0.0036 volts with a 12-bit scope. Even if we set the scope to plus or minus 20 volts, 40 volts total, that still gives us an accuracy of 0.0097 volts, or a little better than 1/100th of a volt. I've never needed anywhere near that much accuracy. But the same setting on an 8-bit scope would actually give us an accuracy of only 0.156 volts or 156 millivolts. And that's actually enough to make a difference, and that is why you need a 12-bit scope. So be sure to check out Matt's article for a full explanation. The link is in the description below. I want to talk about a specification that you can't really find on any spec sheet, at least not as a single specification. You'd have to have some engineering level information to really know what a scope's true DSP capabilities were. So this is more of an objective spec, one that experienced scope users can see when they compare one scope to another. So why am I even bringing it up? Because good DSP is not cheap. Remember a few minutes ago when I said Snap-on cheats using DSP? Like we showed when discussing bandwidth, all digital storage oscilloscopes measuring is done with an analog signal, not a digital signal. That analog signal is then changed by an analog to digital converter. The signal is processed to what we see on the waveform. The oversimplified description of DSP is how well and how quickly the scope can translate these signals and calculate where the plot point should be. Is the hardware fast so that it can handle more complex algorithms to keep up with the millions of samples taken per second? Snap-on has some of the best DSP on the market. This means it can quickly handle more complex algorithms that other scopes cannot do. The better the algorithm, the better it's able to calculate or predict the correct plot point. I know it seems like it should just stick a dot at the place it measured, but that's not really how it works. The better the DSP, the more accurate your waveform will represent what is actually happening. This means good hardware, good computer processors, and this is not cheap. This is another place that scopes like the Handtech fail miserably. Pico also has some pretty good DSP and uses it in places other than just plotting the waveform. It uses it for the resolution enhancement feature, which allows it to simulate a 16-bit scope from a 12-bit scope. It predicts where things would be if a 16-bit scope were being used. So, like I just said about DSP, let's talk about all of the hardware. Good quality hardware, not cheap. But if you want a scope to last, hardware quality of the entire scope is important. Like any other automotive tool, you get what you pay for. The buffer is how much information can be stored. It's memory, if you will. If you want to record a larger waveform at higher sample rates, you will need a larger buffer to hold all of that information. It's basically how much temporary memory the scope has. The Pico 4423 can hold 32 million samples in its buffer. So if using one channel, you get 32 million samples in a waveform. If using two channels, you get 16 per channel. If using all four, you get 8 million per channel in one waveform. That's the one I use, the 4423. But the newer Picos, like the 4425, have a buffer size of 250 million samples for one channel. It similarly divides that up as more channels are being used. Once the buffer has been transferred to your laptop, it empties and begins capturing the next waveform. Now, Snap-on and E-scope buffers work differently than the Pico, so a direct comparison is not really fair to those scopes. Technically, the Snap-on scope's only 512K. It's not even 1 meg. And that's 256K per channel for the Vantage Pro. I'm not really sure about the 4-channel Snap-on scopes, but I believe they're still at 256 per channel, 256,000 per channel, so that would be a combined 1 meg. But the Snap-on E-scope buffers don't empty out like the Pico does. Instead, they're continuously running and always dumping out the old data out the back door and bringing in new data through the front door. It's a constant pass-through of data instead of filling it, dumping it, and refilling it. In this way, they actually have an advantage over the Pico. One of the problems with Pico is that you can actually miss some of the information if an intermittent problem falls in what has been dubbed the Pico gap by many techs. Let's say you have your scope connected to the crank sensor and you're waiting for a vehicle to die so you can see if the crank sensor stopped working. Then, just as the buffer fills, like it will on the screen, there's a slight delay. I don't know if you caught that, but there was a slight delay from the time the buffer filled to the time it started capturing a new waveform. Well, if the car dies right in that slight delay, Murphy's Law says that's where it will fall, then you'll miss the fault. With the Snap-on and the E-scope, you get a continuous waveform without any lapse in coverage because the new data is just pushing out the old data. So there is no pause while the scope dumps the data and starts to capture a new waveform. Now, with Pico, you have a huge buffer, and the software on the laptop can hold multiple waveforms, not just one. I think the default setting is 32 waveforms, but you can change that. So you can take your time about getting to the scope to pause it, but you do have a small chance that you missed something that you might have needed. With the Snap-on, you won't miss anything, but you don't have much time to stop the scope when a fault presents itself. If you wait too long, the information you want will get dumped out the back door because the buffer is so small. I've heard comments from many people that the Snap-on scopes are easier to use than a pico. Pico scopes are more complex, more advanced. I don't actually think this is true at all. Yes, the pico does have exponentially more options and more controls and settings than the snap-on scopes, but the functions that the snap-on and pico share are just as easy to use on a pico as they are on a snap-on. Do all these extra controls really make the basic functions harder to use? No, there's just more functions that you can use if you want to. If you only use the functions offered by Snap-on, then the pico is just as easy to use. Support is another important thing, and not just technical support from the company, but community support as well. Places like IATN and Facebook groups offer really good community support for Snap-on and pico. There are some for eScope as well, but not as much. I am not being paid, endorsed, or compensated in any way for making this video. These really are my opinions. In fact, pico they don't even know who I am or no idea that I'm making this video. But in my professional opinion, the best scope out there to buy is the pico. It is far and away out front when it comes to automotive scopes. Nobody else even comes close. I know this video is probably look like a pico infomercial, but I can assure you that neither pico, Snap-on, or AESwave, or no one else has given me anything to make this video. These really are my opinions. If there were other good choices, I would have mentioned them, because I want techs out there to have the best they can have to diagnose cars. I know some of you already have the eScope or a Snap-on, and I want you to understand that I'm not bashing those. I'm just saying that pico's a better choice if you're looking to buy one now. If you already have one of the other two, then that's fine. But I will bash the Hantac and any of the other cheap Chinese knockoff scopes. They are complete garbage. Don't waste your money. Speaking of money, oscilloscopes prices are actually very, very good. The amount of power you can buy for $1,000 to $2,000 is amazing to what you could get not that long ago. You can get a 2-channel pico new for under $1,000. A 4 or 8 channel is what I would actually recommend, and they're a little under $2,000 for the 4-channel, a little over $2,000 for the 8. To be honest, you don't really need an 8-channel scope, but the price difference isn't really big between those two. So if you can splurge an extra couple $100 and you're already getting the 4-channel, then yeah, you might as well go ahead and get the 8-channel. Automotive diagnostics with a scope will require accessories. If all you can afford right now is the scope itself, then go ahead and just get the scope and get started learning. But if you can swing it, it's actually a pretty good deal to get one of the kits. These come with all the accessories that you will eventually want, and you can pick and choose from different kits. Some have more accessories, some have less. But at the very least, you need to get a low amp probe. Like the high amp probe and some of the other accessories are luxuries, but the low amp probe is a necessity, and you will want to get one of those. You'll eventually want a pressure transducer as well, and this is another area where I do not want you to waste your money on the cheap ones. Just bite the bullet and get the pico WPS. The WPS is 10 times better than the next closest competitor, which would be the Fluke PD350. I know the pressure transducer is a big pill to swallow. It's $1,500 for the full kit with all the adapters you're going to need, but it's worth every penny. I've used a lot of pressure transducers, and the pico WPS is far and away superior in every way to all the others. Just don't get the idea that you can spend $100 or $200 on a cheap pressure transducer and actually get something that's accurate. It's the same as expecting a good oscilloscope for $200 like the Hantac. If you want good tools that work, you've got to pay for them. To be honest, I'd rather see you buy a good quality used scope than spend money on a cheap quality new scope. The used scope will be far better, so if money's an issue, keep your eye out on places like IATN or even Facebook Marketplace and see if you can get a good deal on a used scope. The best place to buy a new one is AESwave.com. They have great prices on picos and all the accessories you're going to need, and they sometimes can get used scopes. People will occasionally trade in their 2-channel for a 4-channel, or maybe their 4 for an 8. So if money's an issue, give them a call and see if they can find you a used one. I do have to give a disclaimer here that I do know George and Carlos at AESwave.com, but this is not a paid advertisement. They're a great group of guys, and it's where I buy all my diagnostic equipment at full price. They have really good service and great prices, so I'll put a link in the description below so you can check out their website. The only other scope I would consider buying is one of the Snap-on scopes. If you really like Snap-on products, then they're okay for automotive diagnostics. The best one, probably the Vantage Pro. It only has 2 channels, but I prefer it to one of the combo tools. I know a lot of the shops out there already have one of the combo tools like a Modus or a Zeus, and those are fine. But if you're out to buy a new one and you want to stay with Snap-on, then the Vantage Pro is probably a better choice. It's lighter, easier to handle, it's cheaper, but most importantly, you don't have 2 tools tied up in one box. That limits your ability to scan and scope something simultaneously. The advantage Snap-on has is it's a rugged, self-contained unit. You don't need a laptop. To some people, that is important. There are other options like an E-scope or a Fluke, but in my opinion, you don't get the same value as you do with a pico. Pico specs are far superior to the E-scope, and the E-scope actually costs more than a pico. While some of the Fluke oscilloscopes may technically be more powerful than a pico, these are not automotive scopes, and they're not really suited for that environment. Well, that brings this episode to a close. In the next episode, we will finally begin scope training. The first subject will be how to get a usable waveform on the screen, and we will be doing that by discussing voltage settings, time settings, and sample rate. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any future posts. If you'd like to help support this channel, you can do so through Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description below. Every little bit helps. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day.